The next lecture covers the essentials for biological life. What is actually required for life? We cover this material with a huge caveat. The caveat is that we don't know the general answer to the question. All we have is one example of biology, what happened on this planet starting about 4 billion years ago. We have a theory of biology for this planet, involving the microscopic mechanism of DNA as an information carrier and the macroscopic mechanism as natural selection for showing the evolution of species. But we don't know if these mechanisms and these theories of biology are universal. So even though the ingredients appear to be universal, we have to be cautious in talking about the mechanisms of biology because we only have one example to study. With that understood, we can talk about what biologists think is essential for life on the Earth and by presumption elsewhere. The two ingredients that seem to be critical are water and carbon. So terrestrial life as our only example, we know that it does need these two ingredients. Almost every organism on Earth uses water in multiple ways. Life on Earth began in water. The Earth is a watery planet, even though the water of the Earth's oceans and inside the rocks is a very small fraction of the mass of the planet. It's a significant ingredient of the biosphere, the place where life exists. And so we expect other forms of life and other places where life might exist in the universe to need water as well. And we think life does need carbon. Carbon is by far the most versatile element for making long chains of molecules and essentially for building complexity. And since biology is complex, and intelligence and sophisticated higher life forms are extremely complex, we need a base ingredient that sustains and encourages complexity. Let's look again at what the human body is contained. And this is typical of all biological creatures, of course. 96% of the human body is made of just 4 elements: hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen. Biologists would say there are another dozen or maybe 15 trace elements that are important for our chemistry, including magnesium, calcium, even selenium. These trace elements, we have no idea, because we can't do more than a thought experiment, as to whether biology could exist without those trace elements. But the 4 key ones we're confident life is based on and probably needs. Hydrogen is the simplest element, with 1 electron to bond to other elements. It can, of course, form a molecule, but it can also form complex chains with that 1 free electron. Oxygen has 6 free electrons, but generally only bonds with 2 other atoms. Oxygen is also highly reactive. Nitrogen has an odd number of available electrons, and that limits its potential for bonding with other elements. Carbon has 4 valence electrons, which results in an enormous number of possible combinations. Essentially, carbon is promiscuous chemically and can bond easily and readily, especially with carbon. And so hydrocarbons, which we know of the basis of organic chemistry, can form in essentially infinite number of ways. A carbon molecule bonded with hydrogen atom makes what is called an organic molecule. That's the definition. And organic molecules are the basis of biological life, because they're based on this versatile bonding property of the carbon atom. We can see some simple examples. For instance, methane, where the carbon bonds with 4 hydrogen atoms. We can see carbonic acid, which is a fundamental ingredient in human and animal blood. And then we can see more complex chemicals like hormones and neurotransmitters, which are also organic molecules, with hydrogen and carbon skeletons, long chains, loops, side chains, and so on. The geometric and chemical complexity of hydrogen and carbon compounds is, as I said, almost infinite. And each particular compound has its own chemical properties and role in biology. Organic molecules are not uniquely confined to the Earth. When we're talking about the ingredients of life being widespread in the universe, we should remember that molecules also exist in space. I talked about how atoms or elements are produced inside stars, but in the cooler regions of space, molecules can exist. Notice that inside stars, you only can have elements, and in fact, all the atoms are ionized, which is to say have their electrons stripped off by the very high temperature inside stars. But the cooler regions of space between stars, such as molecular clouds or the interstellar medium, have temperatures of tens of Kelvin, or maybe up to 100 Kelvin. And at these low temperatures, when atoms bounce into each other or react on the surface of a dust grain, which is a very important mechanism, you can form complexity and molecules. As we speak, there are something like 130 different molecules that have been measured in interstellar space, and there are more found almost every year. These range in number up to the number of the simplest amino acids, about a dozen atoms. I think the largest is about 19 atoms. So these are by no means trivial molecules. And with 130 of them, some of them are biologically potentially very important, such as the amino acid. But biology cannot form, we think, in deep space. However, it is important to know that the biological ingredients at the level of molecules do exist in deep space and do exist in the molecular clouds where stars will form and planets will form. Some of our best indications of this have also come to the Earth. The molecules that I previously talked about, discovered in space, are typically found with radio telescopes, because while atomic transitions in elements tend to make spectral features in the optical or ultraviolet region, the rotational and vibrational states of molecules have much lower energy. And so those spectral features are seen at long wavelengths, typically the far infrared, millimeter, or even radio region. So the discovery of molecules in space, in deep space, at low temperatures, has been found by radio telescopes in the last 50 years. And as we combine radio telescopes into interferometers, radio methods actually have enough angular resolution to pin down the locations of these molecules quite specifically. So this is how we find molecules remotely. But how do we talk about molecules in space from observations on the Earth? There we have to rely on luck. We have to rely on meteorites that land to Earth. Now, meteorites, depending on their origin, are typically samples of deep space, and at their best, they're primordial samples of the solar system that condensed or formed their rocky material very early on, close to the formation time, 4.5 billion years ago. Perhaps the most famous, and still very useful for research purposes, meteorite is the Murchison meteorite, which fell to Earth in Victoria, Australia in 1969. Now, meteorites fall to Earth every year, and there are many that are as big as this one and some that are much bigger. So what was special about the Murchison meteorite? What was special was that it fell in a very arid part of the Australian desert, and it was seen and recovered without contamination, literally within hours of its fall. The problem with meteorites as samples of the distant universe, or the distant solar system, is that as soon as they hit the Earth's surface, or enter the Earth's atmosphere even, they begin to be contaminated by terrestrial material. With the Murchison meteorite, it was found so quickly and protected from the Earth's atmosphere and from contamination by humans that it has provided enormous amount of information in labs around the world over time. And actually, as the analysis techniques have got better, people continue to get new information for the Murchison meteorite. Well, this meteorite showed that it contained amino acids, alcohols, purines, and pyrimidines, which are found as components of DNA, and a number of other complex compounds. Some of the amino acids found in the Murchison meteorite are not amino acids used in life itself, and that's not surprising. In theory and in principle, there are 100,000 different amino acids possible, and life only uses 20 of those. So some of the amino acids found in the Murchison were those amino acids that biology on the Earth uses, and some were not. Equally important is the handedness of the molecules. Molecules with a shape can have a handedness, like a glove, being left or right-handed. Molecules in the Murchison meteorite were found equally in the left and right-handed versions, whereas terrestrial life has used only one-handedness of the two possible versions, each of which are chemically identical in the way they behave. This represents an efficiency of biology, given two choices to settle on one set of interactions with one shape of molecules. The fact that Murchison had equal number of both shapes does indicate that it doesn't represent living material itself. What about water? Water is really important for life. It ranges in its composition and its fraction in living and organic material by a large factor. In jellyfish, it's about 99% of their composition. In the driest bug you might find in an arid place, it's down around 30%. Humans are in the middle at about 60% or 2/3. But water is essentially a significant percentage of all biological life. If you're thinking in evolutionary terms, life on Earth, on the land surface, migrated to the land about 500 million years ago after originating in water. And so we're still carrying around as sacks of water, the water that life formed on very early on in the history of the Earth. Why water, or what is special about water that it would be a base ingredient for life? Water is particularly good for facilitating interactions and biological mechanisms. First of all, water is a solvent, and so you can dissolve many chemicals and minerals in water. This is standard in chemistry. Anyone studying chemistry is very familiar with this. What that means is if you have a body of water, many things can dissolve in it and interact and then form other combinations. So water forms a rich basis for chemical complexity because of the way it dissolves and facilitates interactions. Now, this is a double-edged sword because in biology, as biochemists are aware of, water also can have an effect of destroying important molecules. So while it facilitates interactions and combinations, in some situations, it actually is a solvent and dissolves those compounds. So biology has had to fight against that current to gain complexity in the presence of water. The cells inside our body are little water sacs, little chemical factories filled with concentrated chemicals, and those chemicals have been concentrated in a water medium. Water also facilitates basic biological processes like transferring nutrients from one part of a cell to another and eliminating wastes from a cell. It's also quite stable as a molecule over a range of temperatures that are conducive to biological life. So its thermal and physical properties essentially act to buffer physical extremes of temperature and pressure, and so protect life and give it a narrow, comfortable range of parameters to work in. Water is abundant in the solar system. The Earth may be the water world of the solar system, but it's certainly not unique. We also have Europa, which is the watery moon of Jupiter, found by Galileo with the first telescope. And that water world actually is completely covered by oceans under an ice cap and rivals perhaps in total the amount of water on the Earth's surface, a much larger planet. We also think there are bodies of water under the surface of Mars. Very recent radar measurements of the Mars south polar cap have shown that there are liquid bodies of water, and they're kept liquid by pressure from the surface rock and ice and by mild radioactive heating from the interior. We also think Mars has subsurface aquifers, more limited bodies of water that can occasionally erupt onto the surface. This map here is essentially a water map of Mars done with spectroscopic techniques. And if you took the full census or inventory of water on Mars, most of which is in the form of ice because of its cold temperature, and were able to melt it, it would form a puddle on the whole planet about 4 centimeters deep. That's not maybe as impressive as the Earth's oceans, but it's a substantial amount of water. We also have the situation of Enceladus, a surprise a few decades ago when we saw icy geysers streaming out into space. This tiny moon, about the size of Rhode Island, was not on anyone's radar in astrobiology as a potential site for life, and yet it appears to have liquid water, because these icy geysers almost certainly result from pressurized liquid water erupting through the surface. How does a tiny little moon generate the situation for liquid water, especially so far from the sun, where the temperature is very cold? In this case, it's because of a mild amount of geological heating from the interior rock, and that rock is additionally heated by tidal forces from its host planet. Essentially, Jupiter acts to squeeze all of the moons that orbit it with elliptical orbits, and that adds quite a lot of heat to the rock, which can liquefy water or melt ice under the surface. Water could not exist on the surface of moons this far from the sun. Other models of planetary bodies in the solar system, in particular moons of giant planets, suggest that in total there may be a dozen moons of giant planets, including moons of Uranus and Neptune, where there is water kept liquid under a crust of ice and rock. That's a dozen places with liquid water in the solar system, so it's by no means just the Earth. We also know, with very recent observations, that water has been detected in the atmosphere of a handful of exoplanets. The way this is done is with a clever experiment which backlights the exoplanet with its parent star and then does spectroscopy of light filtering through the atmosphere, seen in illumination like this along the limb. Essentially, the atmosphere imprints a set of molecular transitions from the ingredients in that atmosphere. And so in a handful of cases, water has been detected this way. Now these are all quite hot exoplanets, so in these cases the water is steam, so steam in the atmosphere of an exoplanet. No observations are yet able to detect a water surface body on an exoplanet. That's some distance away. But we do know of situations where the exoplanet has properties where liquid water could exist on its surface, even if we can't measure it yet. When we're thinking of the ingredients for life, biologists consider two are essential. One is water. Water is essential for life because objects like us and all biological species, plants and animals, consist of water, from 1/3 to 90% water. Water facilitates chemical reactions and the basic functions of a cell, and also water is quite widely abundant in the universe. It's one of the most abundant molecules in the universe, and it exists not just on the Earth, but probably in subterranean situations on about a dozen objects in the solar system. Water has been seen in distant galaxies, for example, at distances of billions of light years. The other core ingredient is carbon. Carbon has chemical properties that facilitate reactions with other atoms and molecules. And carbon and hydrogen in particular can form long chains and loops and form essentially infinitely complex molecules. So as a basis for biological complexity, carbon is truly special. And as we know from our study of stellar evolution, carbon is abundant in the universe. So these two key ingredients for biology do appear to be universal.